All right, Deuteronomy chapter 13. We've been reading about the guidelines of how to test the authenticity of a prophet. And we've also been seeing that the punishment for polytheism under Deuteronomy is the capital punishment. And that all ties in with what we've been talking about, is that the gravest offense in Deuteronomy, the greatest offense in the Old Testament, arguably still, it's paganism. It is to not worship God, but to go play the harlot and worship other gods. So we'll pick up at chapter 13:12, just so you can continue to get a sense of like how vehemently Deuteronomy addresses this topic. Chapter 13, verse 12. If you hear in one of your cities, which the Lord your God gives you to dwell there, that certain base fellows have gone out among you and have drawn away the inhabitants of the city, saying, let us go and serve other gods, which you have not known, then you shall inquire and make search and ask diligently, and behold, if it be true and certain that such an abominable thing has been done among you, you shall surely put the inhabitants of that city to the sword, destroying it utterly, all who are in it and its cattle with the edge of the sword. You shall gather all its spoil into the midst of the open square, and burn the city and all its spoil of fire as a whole burnt offering to the Lord your God. It shall be a heap forever. It shall not be built again. None of the devoted things shall cling to your hand, that the Lord may turn from the fierceness of his anger and show you mercy and have compassion on you and multiply you, as he swore to your fathers, if you obey the voice of the Lord your God, keeping all his commandments, which I command you this day, and doing what is right in the sight of the Lord your God. Ashron asked an interesting question after class that I think would be good to point out to all of you. At the end of verse 13, it talks about, let us go and serve other gods, which you have not known. All right, and remember, knowledge it's that covenantal language. So it's not just that these gods are unfamiliar to them, like, I never heard of Baal. But it's that they're outside the covenant. They have no familial relationship with you. You're like in Yahweh's family. So when you see that knowledge, that use of the word of knowing, it's definitely filled with covenantal meaning. All right, let's jump ahead to verse 22. Chapter 14, verse 22. Regulation concerning tithes. So chapter 14, verse 22, I'd like you to make a note that this is a great explanation of tithing and sacrifice. All right, if you want to get into the theology of tithing, the theology of sacrificing to God, this is a really good passage. Sacrifices are supposed to change who? You. All right, us. They don't change God, they change us. They change the person offering the sacrifice. Verse 22, you shall tithe all the yield of your seed which comes forth from the field year by year. And before the Lord your God, in the place which he will choose to make his name dwell there, you shall eat the tithe of your grain, of your wine, and of your oil, and the firstlings of your herd and flock, that you may learn to fear the Lord your God always. And if the way is too long for you, so that you're not able to bring the tithe, when the Lord your God blesses you, because the place is too far from you, which the Lord your God chooses to set his name there, then you shall turn it into money and bind up the money in your hand and go to the place which the Lord your God chooses. All right, so in the place where God's going to choose his name to dwell, eventually that's going to become Jerusalem, right? But at this time, they're not in the promised land. They haven't conquered Jerusalem. They don't know where the temple is going to be constructed yet. So the location is ambiguous, but bring a tenth of everything you grow and your produce and give it to God. But if that's too hard because you live on the complete opposite side of the country, away from Jerusalem, then just sell your stuff and then bring it the monetary value. Verse 25, then you shall turn it into money and bind up the money in your hand and go to the place which the Lord your God chooses and spend the money for whatever you desire. Oxen or sheep or wine or strong drink, whatever your appetite craves, and you shall eat there before the Lord your God and rejoice, you and your household. So you may have been expecting, sell the money, sell your cattle and your wheat, and bring the money to Jerusalem and donate it to the temple. But no, go out, have a nice meal. Find whatever your favorite wine is, whatever your favorite cut of meat is, and spend the money on this. And rejoice, you and your household. Okay, so bring your family, treat your entire family and all the servants of your household, and do this splurge of a party. Verse 27, and you shall not forsake the Levite who's within your towns, for he has no portion of inheritance with you. So if there's any Levites, invite them to the party as well. All right, so it's not because the temple in Jerusalem needs to suck up all this money, right? Or it's not because the temple in Jerusalem needs to be collecting all the food and the storage and whatnot. But when we sacrifice the first 10%, we're giving up our security. When you give up your security, you're then relying on God. And God is totally fine in Deuteronomy with you giving up your security by just throwing a giant party for you and your family and consuming up your first 10%, that security that way. And now you can rely on faith and on God for the rest of your produce to come in, the remaining 90%. Verse 28, at the end of every 3 years, you shall bring forth all the tithe of your produce in the same year and lay it up within your towns. And the Levite, because he has no portion or inheritance with you, and the sojourner and the fatherless and the widow who are within your towns shall come and eat and be filled, that the Lord your God may bless you in the work of your hands that you do. So every 3 years, your tithe is going to go to the poor people living in the city, to the strangers, non-Israelites, who just happen to be passing through, to the Levites who don't really own any land. And so that's the point of the tithe. All right. Let's jump ahead to chapter 16. In chapter 16, there's the regulations regarding the three major festivals are reiterated. So it's Passover. The Feast of Weeks is also another name for Pentecost. So Passover, Pentecost, and Booths. And you can make a note at the start of chapter 16 to Exodus 23, verses 14 through 20. You can have that as a comparison and go back to looking at the original proclamation of the festal cycle. Yeah, Exodus 23, verses 14 through 20. So what do you do when Passover time comes? Jump ahead to verse 3. You shall eat no leavened bread with it. 7 days you shall eat it with unleavened bread and the bread of affliction. For you came out of the land of Egypt in hurried flight, that all the days of your life you may remember the day when you came out of the land of Egypt. What's the point of keeping the Passover? Catechesis, right? Why are we eating this unleavened bread? So you remember how quickly we got out of Egypt, right? That's how the faith is passed on through these feasts and these prayers of remembrance. Jump ahead to verse 9. You shall count 7 weeks. How long is 7 weeks? And Pentecost is 50 days after Easter. It's after Passover. Okay, so the Feast of Weeks. The weeks of a week. 7 days in a week, 7 weeks. Feast of Weeks. Pentecost. Same thing. Verse 9. You shall count 7 weeks. Begin to count the 7 weeks from the time you first put the sickle to the standing grain. Then you shall keep the Feast of Weeks to the Lord your God with the tribute of a freewill offering from your hand, which you shall give as the Lord your God blesses you. Jump down to verse 13. You shall keep the Feast of Booths. 7 days when you make your ingathering from your threshing floor and your winepress. All right, it's the fruit harvest. Why do they dwell in booths? To remember the days of dwelling in tents in the wilderness. Jump ahead to verse 16. 3 times a year your male shall appear before the Lord your God at the place which he will choose. All right. Again, that's a reference to what eventually is going to become Jerusalem. 3 times a year, you make a journey down to Jerusalem to celebrate these great feasts. All right. That's why when Christ is executed at the Passover, Why is he in Jerusalem? Because he's going to Jerusalem to fulfill the law, to celebrate the Passover down there. Okay. Pentecost in the early church. Why on the first Pentecost does Peter go out and preach to all these Jews who are from all over the world and they're in Jerusalem on the day of Pentecost? Because for those feasts, everyone travels to Jerusalem to celebrate the Feast of Pentecost. All right, and that's why there's Jews who speak different languages, and there's the miracle of Peter speaking, in one language, but everyone understanding in their own language. Yes?
So, in that, you know how like before the Tower of Babel,
Yes.
people spoke like the same language. Was the speaking in the tongues like every person heard his own language, or was it like it was the one unified language again, which is why they all understood it?
It was everyone hearing it in their own language, but we still do see that miracle at Pentecost being the undoing of the Tower of Babel, and that's in the liturgy of Pentecost that you remember, like that the curse of Babel has been undone. But if you were a Latin-speaking Jew, you were comprehending it in Latin. All right, let's jump ahead to chapter 17, verse 14, which is a very, 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 very important passage in Deuteronomy. Chapter 17, verse 14, limitations of royal authority. When you come to the land which the Lord your God gives you, and you possess it and dwell in it, and then say, I will set a king over me, like all the nations that are round about me, you may indeed set a king over you, him whom the Lord your God will choose. All right, so to start off the context, kings are an allowance. Just like divorce in the Old Testament is an allowance. It is not ideal. We've already talked about how Israel has a king. Who is Israel's king? God. So when Israel says, we want to have a king to be like the other nations, all the stinking pagans, those losers that are around you about you, okay? That's not the ideal. But God's going to make an allowance for them. So Israel having a human king is the same type of allowance as Israel being permitted to have bills of divorce. All right. Verse 15, you may indeed set a king over you, him whom the Lord your God will choose. One from among your brethren you shall set as king over you. You may not put a foreigner over you who is not your brother. All right. So you may not put a foreigner over you. Highlight that. Super important. A non-Israelite is not permitted to be king over the nation. When the Pharisees and scribes, all right, and the priests, the Sanhedrin, condemn Jesus for breaking the law of Moses, and they bring Jesus before Pilate, and Pilate says, hey, isn't this guy your king? Does anyone remember what they all say in response to Pilate? We have no king but Caesar. So the hypocrisy in the Gospels of the Sanhedrin, like if you know the Old Testament and the law of Moses, like it's everywhere. So the Jews accept Caesar, and they also were complicit with Herod, who's an Edomite, as being their king. So that's also like going on in the dialogue when Jesus is asking about the coin and whose image is on the coin. That's also like he's kind of taking a jab at them because they're trying to get him to admit he doesn't follow the law, but then everyone's collecting taxes and paying tribute to Caesar. All right, so one, you can't have a foreigner over you. Verse 16, only he must not multiply horses for himself or cause the people to return to Egypt in order to multiply horses, since the Lord has said to you, you shall never return that way again. All right, so underline, he can't multiply his horses. That's illegal for the king to do that. Great question. It means he can't grow his army of horses. Like, And he definitely cannot go down to Egypt to get horses. Egyptian horses in the ancient world are like the P. Sherman tanks, right? You get a cavalry of swift, fast Egyptian horses, you're going to have a very strong army. The point of this is it has to do with the king relying on God and not on his own might. Verse 17, and he shall not multiply his wives. Underline that. Rule number 2 for the king. Can't multiply your horses. Can't multiply your wives. For himself, lest his heart turn away. Now, why would a king multiply his wives? Isn't one enough? No, what you would do in the ancient world is you would set up treaties by exchanging brides with each other. All right, so if Israel wanted to enter into an alliance with Egypt, Egypt would send Pharaoh's daughter and marry the king of Israel. And now you have that familial tie, and you're going to work out your negotiations better. You're now family. You're not going to invade one another. That's great. Okay, now the king also wants to make an alliance with Assyria. So now the Assyrian king is going to send one of his daughters. And now you have multiple wives going on, and you're going to make these treaties with everyone by marrying into them. And with so many wives, you're going to end up with enough daughters of your own to send out to other nations to set up as your own treaty, so on and so forth.
So basically, it was a bargaining chips. In reality, the kids and the wives.
Yeah, they're walking treaty documents and ambassadors. All right, don't multiply your wives. That's rule number 2. Nor shall he greatly multiply for himself silver and gold. Rule number 3. Why can you not multiply silver and gold? Is it because wealth is bad? No, it's because the other means of self-defense in the ancient world is that you can just pay an army to not invade you. All right? And this is how Rome actually secured the majority of its empire. It would show up with this giant army and overwhelm the village and say, look, we can either kill all of you, or you can sign up to pay tribute to Caesar, and we'll set up our tax collector, we'll put you under our providence, you'll enter into our legal system, and things might get better for you. Do you agree to that, or do you want us to just slave everyone here? And they agree, okay, we're going to pay tributes. But if there's a roaming army and you're a king with great wealth, you can just pay them off to go home and not bother with you. Because what they're after anyway is wealth and success or paying tribute. So the more gold and silver you have, the more people you can just pay off to not bother you. So these 3 bands, it all has to do with security. Don't rely on the human means of security, building up your own army, building up your own treaties, and building up your own wealth. Let God be the one who protects you. So make a note here to 1 Kings chapter 10, verses 14 through 29. 1 Kings chapter 10, verses 14 through 29. Everyone knows the story of Solomon and how he took multiple wives. Before you get to the part about his wives, though, you start to realize Solomon starts multiplying his horses, and he gets them from Egypt. Solomon starts collecting so much gold and blah, 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 blah. And then you get to, and Solomon also multiplied his wives, da, 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 da. So the wives part's the famous part of the story, but when you read 1 Kings, you see Solomon's actually breaking all of the limitations that the set up for the kings. Yeah.
Well, I mean, it did say in the dream that after Solomon said, yeah, give me wisdom, please. God was like, since you have asked for this, I will grant you, not only will I grant you what you've asked for, but I'll also give you wealth and honor. But so the wealth part and the power might part, sure, they were maybe God bent the rules for that, but I think the major focus, this major sin of things, because God never said, I'll give you wives. He said, yeah, I'll give you wealth and I'll give you great name for yourself. And it's not like, yeah, I'll give you wives and too.
Yeah, so
Said,
think of one of Solomon's crowning achievements is the construction of the temple, right? So similar to when the Israelites leave Egypt, they despoil the Egyptians. What does God give that wealth to Solomon to do? It's to construct the temple, which he does. And it's not that the wealth is inherently evil. But what Solomon's doing is if Solomon's holding in for the private coffers and just amassing it, and it's not amassing for the kingdom's good as a whole, but you're amassing it for the purpose of growing your own influence, I think that's where you can start to nitpick in wealth's not intrinsically evil, but we're meant to be stewards according to God's will.
Yes.
So how do you discern that as Solomon to be the proper
That is
steward?
also true. Like Ecclesiastes when it says, "I've created great vineyards, I've created great buildings, and undertook great architectural projects, and yet they are like chasing the wind."
Yeah.
So he, in his own personal memoirs, he did do those. And he did, yes, help the kingdom. He also did create private projects and all those for his own vanity, and yet it brought him to not ruin, but ruin of his heart.
Yeah,
So
I mean,
it's like chasing the wind. So
right. Okay, good. Verse 18. And when he sits on the throne of his kingdom, he shall write for himself in a book the copy of this law. So what's the fourth rule he's supposed to do? He's supposed to handwrite a copy out of Deuteronomy from that which is in charge of the Levitical priests, and it shall be with him, and he shall read it in all the days of his life. So he's supposed to handwrite his own copy of Deuteronomy, and then he's supposed to read it daily. And we're going to see that most of the kings of Israel don't do this, right? Because actually the Deuteronomy, the law, gets lost for a couple of generations, and it's rediscovered. That he may learn to fear the Lord his God by keeping all the words of this law and these statutes and doing them, and that his heart may not be lifted up above his brethren, and that he may not turn aside from the commandment either to the right hand or to the left, so that he may continue long in his kingdom, he and his children in Israel. All right, let's jump ahead to chapter 18, verse 15. The Lord your God will raise up for you a prophet like me from among you, from your brethren. Him you shall heed. So Moses is explaining to Israel how the succession plan is going to go, because Moses is about to croak. The Lord your God will raise you up a prophet like me from among you, and your brethren, him you shall heed. Who's he referring to? He's referring to Joshua. But the church fathers also see this as a prophecy of the resurrection of the second Joshua, that God is going to raise up this prophet. And Joshua is kind of like Moses, but they're different. But there's a lot more similarities between Christ and Moses, the second Joshua. And so you get this verse that's well known as a foreshadowing of as I said, God raising Christ from the dead. Just as you desired of the Lord your God at Horeb on the day of the assembly, when you said, let me not hear again the voice of the Lord my God, or see this great fire any more lest I die. Verse 17. And the Lord said to me, they have rightly said all that they have spoken. I will raise up for them a prophet like you among their brethren, and I will put my words in his mouth, and he shall speak to them all that I command him. And whoever will not give heed to my words when he shall speak in my name, I myself will require it of him. But the prophet who presumes to speak a word in my name, which I have not commanded him to speak, or who speaks in the name of other gods, that same prophet shall die. So at verse 20, I'd underline that, and I'd make a note to 1 Kings chapter 13. 1 Kings chapter 13, verses 11 through 32. That reference to 1 Kings chapter 13, verse 11 through 32, that deals with an example of a prophet who presumes to speak a word in Yahweh's name, but he actually was not committed to speak. Verse 21, and if you say in your heart, how may we know the word which the Lord has not spoken? When a prophet speaks in the name of the Lord, if that word does not come to pass or come true, that is a word which the Lord has not spoken. The prophet has spoken it presumptuously. You need not be afraid of him. And for verse 22 and following, you can make a note to Jeremiah chapter 14, verse 14.
verses?
Jeremiah 14:14. All right, chapter 19, we get more regulations about the cities of refuge, right? That's where the manslaughters get to flee to. Just make a note to Joshua 20. In the book of Joshua, chapter 20, it's when they set up, they follow the rules and regulations of Deuteronomy, and they set up those cities of refuge. Jump ahead to chapter 20. Chapter 20, verse 5. Then the officers shall speak to the people. So this is when war breaks out. The officers shall speak to the people, saying, "What man is there that has built a new house and has not dedicated it? Let him go back to his house, lest he die in the battle, and another man dedicate it." This is the process for thinning out the forces. So when war breaks out, you do a draft, and then you go through everyone. You say, all right, who just bought a house? If you just bought a house, go home. Let him go back to his house, lest he die in the battle, another man dedicate it. Verse 6. What man is there that has planted a vineyard and has not enjoyed its fruit? Let him go back to his house, lest he die in battle, another man enjoy its fruit. And what man is there that is betrothed a wife and has not taken her? Let him go back to his house, lest he die in battle, another man take her. And the officers shall speak further to the people and say, what man is there that is fearful and faint-hearted? Let him go back to his house. Let the heart of his fellows melt as his heart. And when the officers have made an end of speaking to the people, then commanders shall be appointed to the head of the people. All right, so you whittle down the forces. Did you buy a house? Did you just get engaged? Did you just plant a vineyard? Are you a chicken? If you're one of these four things, get out. Why? Because, well, God doesn't want anyone to die who's in any of those situations. And if you're a chicken, you're just going to be a liability for us in the battlefield. And we don't need the mass numbers, because who fights our battles for us? Yahweh does. All right. You can make a note to 1 Maccabees chapter 3, verse 56. For the book of Maccabees is all about fidelity to the law and a rebellion attempting to be faithful to the law. And they conduct a draft and they go through this questionnaire, and like you see, like, okay, they're following Deuteronomy to the letter. Yeah. 1 Maccabees chapter 3, verse 56. All right, let's jump ahead to chapter 24. Laws concerning marriage and divorce. Chapter 24, verse 1 begins with the word when. I want you to circle that word when. When a man takes a wife and marries her, circle if then she finds no favor in his eyes, because he has found some indecency in her, and he writes her a bill of divorce, and puts in her hand and sends her out of his house, and she departs out of his house. Verse 2, and circle, and if she goes and becomes another man's wife, and the latter husband dislikes her and writes her a bill of divorce and puts it in her hand and sends her out of his house, or if the latter husband dies who took her to be his wife, verse 4, circle, then her former husband who sent her away may not take her again to be his wife. So what's the end result of this regulation concerning divorce? The husband may not take her again to be his wife. Underline that. All this regulation is a roundabout way of saying, if you get divorced in the law of Moses, you guys are not shacking up again after she has been defiled. For that is an abomination before the Lord, and you shall not bring guilt upon the land which the Lord your God gives you for an inheritance. All right, so in verse 1, if the husband has found some indecency in her, what does indecency mean? Sounds kind of broad and vague, like kind of like a loophole. It's like, you weren't decent enough to me in this argument. So that the Hebrew word has two translations that's here. It could be unhappiness, so if the husband finds some unhappiness in her, or sexual licentiousness. So if she turns out that she's like sexually deviant and not good wife material at all, then you can go ahead and get the bill of divorce. But this is not like the free-for-all divorce and remarriage that we have in American society. And even still, this is an allowance from God, right? Christ is pretty clear, like, even this is really just because of the hardness of your hearts. Like, marriage is not supposed to be dissolved in any way. But if you are going to be dissolved, if you are going to have divorces, then you can't get back together again, after she's sent away from her second husband. Jump ahead to chapter 25, verse 3. There's a regulation on punishments for people. Chapter 25, verse 3. 40 stripes may be given, but no more, lest if one should go on to beat him with more stripes than these, your brother be degraded in your sight. So stripes, that's public scourging, public whipping. So that is a reason I'm pointing out is when Christ is scourged, he's scourged by the Romans. He's not scourged according to the Mosaic law. So what you get from this is Christ at the scourging of the pillar, you're looking at beyond the 40 stripes because it was the Gentiles who were performing it.
He usually went towards death, until death. And then they went after just to make sure.
You're saying the Roman practice was that?
The Roman practice was go to death.
Oh, to go to death, yeah.
Decimation, too.
Right. And let's jump. Actually, I want to jump back with you guys to verse 10 of chapter 24. When you make your neighbor a loan of any sort, you shall not go into his house to fetch his pledge. So when you make a loan, normally someone gives you something as a pledge that they're going to pay back the loan. This is what pawnbrokers do. Okay, if you go to a pawnbroker, they can loan you money, and you would normally hand over your family a nice watch. Okay, and then if you repay the loan, you can buy the watch back from the pawnbroker. But even pawnbrokers aside, this was just a common thing. So if I lent you $50 and then say you handed over to me your PlayStation 5 or whatever as a pledge when you pay me back, like me holding on to your possession was a guarantee that you're going to pay back the loan at some point. All right, so under the law of Moses, when you make your neighbor a loan of any sort, you shall not go into his house to get the pledge. You can't go into his home and forcibly take the pledge back. You shall not. You shall stand outside, and the man to whom you make the loan shall bring the pledge out to you. And if he is a poor man, you shall not sleep in his pledge. So if a poor guy he borrows money from you and you take his cloak and he doesn't have anything but his cloak, for the law of Moses, you cannot hold on to that cloak overnight because that guy has nothing else to sleep in. You have to return the pledge back to him. Verse 13, when the sun goes down, you shall restore to him the pledge that he may sleep in his cloak and bless you, and it shall be righteousness to you before the Lord your God. You shall not oppress a hired servant who is poor and needy, whether he is one of your brethren or one of the sojourners who are in your land within your towns. You shall give him his hire on the day he earns it before the sun goes down, for he is poor and sets his heart upon it, lest he cry against you to the Lord, and it be sin in you. All right, so if you hire someone, especially if they're poor, payday has to come quickly. You cannot withhold wages. Verse 16, the fathers shall not be put to death for the children, nor shall the children be put to death for the fathers. Every man shall be put to death for his own sin. You shall not pervert the justice due to the sojourner or the fatherless, or take a widow's garment in pledge. But you shall remember that you were a slave in Egypt, and the Lord your God redeemed you from there. Therefore, I command you to do this. When you reap your harvest in your field and have forgotten a sheaf in the field, you shall not go back to get it. It shall be for the sojourner, the fatherless, and the widow. And the Lord your God may bless you in all the work of your hands. When you beat your olive trees, you shall not go over the boughs again. It shall be for the sojourner, the fatherless, and the widow. When you gather the grapes of your vineyard, you shall not glean it afterward. It shall be for the sojourner, the fatherless, and the widow, yada, yada. These rules and regulations are the systems being set up to protect the poor, all right? When the poor borrow money, you can't abuse them. And don't be super greedy with going back to make sure you collected every single last grape from your vineyard. The poor people, the land, the orphans, the widows, those who have no economic security, no one to protect them, it's their right then to go through and collect what remains in your fields. All right, let's jump ahead to chapter 27. Now Moses and the elders of Israel commanded the people, saying, keep all the commandments which I command you this day, and on the day you pass over the Jordan to the land which the Lord your God gives you, you shall set up large stones and plaster them with plaster, and you shall write upon them all the words of this law when you pass over to enter the land which the Lord your God gives you, a land flowing with milk and honey, as the Lord, the God of your fathers, has promised you. Interesting side note, the word Hebrew, it means those who pass over, those who cross over. So potentially the origin of, the Israelites being referred to as the Hebrew nation is they're the people who crossed over the Jordan into the promised land. It's like the nickname they got from the locals. Verse 4, and when you have passed over the Jordan, you shall set up these stones concerning which I command you this day on Mount Ebal, and you shall plaster them with plaster. Verse 5, and there you shall build an altar to the Lord your God, an altar of stones. You shall lift up no iron tool upon them. You shall build an altar to the Lord your God of unhewn stones, and you shall offer burnt offerings on it to the Lord your God, and you shall sacrifice peace offerings and shall eat there, and you shall rejoice before the Lord your God. And you shall write upon the stones all the words of this law very plainly. All right, so they're supposed to have these monuments with the inscription of the law as this permanent reminder, right? What's more fixed and lasting than a monolith, right? A giant stone that's going to last there for generations. Jump down to verse 11. And Moses charged the people the same day, saying, when you have passed over the Jordan, these shall stand upon Mount Gerizim to bless the people. Simeon, Levi, Judah, Issachar, Joseph, and Benjamin. And these shall stand upon Mount Ebal for the curse. Reuben, Gad, Asher, Zebulun, Dan, and Naphtali. And the Levites shall declare to all the men of Israel with a loud voice, cursed be the man who makes a graven or molten image, an abomination to the Lord, a thing made by the hands of a craftsman, and sets it up in secret. And all the people shall answer and say, Amen. So as they're about to enter the promised land, they're going to have this magnificent ceremony, okay? They're going to pass in this valley between these two mountains, these two mountain ranges, and representatives from the 12 tribes of Israel are going to be set up on either side. One's going to be chanting the blessings of the law. The other is going to be chanting one's doing the blessings, one's doing the curses. And as the people pass through, this is going to be proclaimed to them, and they're all going to be saying Amen as they enter into the promised land. All right, this is the grand finale, their exit from the wilderness, going into take the land they've been waiting 40 years for. Verse 16, cursed be he who dishonors his father or his mother, and all the people shall say, Amen. Cursed be he who removes his neighbor's landmark. Cursed be he who misleads a blind man on the road. Cursed be he who perverts the justice due to the sojourner, the fatherless, and the widow. Cursed be he who lies with his father's wife, because he has uncovered her who is his father's. Cursed be he who lies with any kind of beast. Cursed be he who lies with his sister, whether the daughter of his father or the daughter of his mother. Cursed be he who lies with his mother-in-law. Cursed be he who takes a bribe to slay. Cursed be he who does not confirm the words of this law by doing them. And then chapter 28 goes over the blessings. We'll resume there tomorrow.